Hello, this is Matheus Mesquita, and this is my Hellenistic period digital history project for History 342, History of Ancient Greece. This presentation will be focusing on the Hellenistic period, which lasted roughly from the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC, to the death of Cleopatra in 30 BC. So our story begins in the city of Babylon, where another story ends. Reading from the text, in the city of Babylon in June of 323 BC, Alexander the Great unexpectedly died at the rather young age of 32. Not only did this occur right after his 13-year conquest of the known world from Egypt to India, it also came at a time when he was still trying to consolidate his gains. What's more, is that Alexander left no instructions as to who should succeed him other than the remark, to the most powerful. This would begin what historians refer to as the Hellenistic period. And over here we have a painting from 1885, which portrays this event. Although, it's probably not the most, I guess you could say, historically accurate, at least to my knowledge. It does capture the enormity of the moment and just how the emotion surrounding it. As you can see, this gentleman is rather sad here. So I just wanted to highlight this. It's from Karl Theodor von Piltoy, or Pilotoy. I'm pretty sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, but oh well. So, Chapter 2, Long Live the Kings. What followed next were a series of conflicts between Alexander's own top generals. After many years of fighting, separate kingdoms eventually formed where the Macedonian Empire once stood. Not only that, but most of these kingdoms would be ruled by the descendants of those aforementioned generals. General Antigonus's family would rule over Macedonia and Greece, Seleucus's in Syria and Persia, and most famously Ptolemy's kin in Egypt. And over here we have a map of the Alexander's empire divided between his different generals. The yellow is the Seleucids, which controlled, as mentioned previously, Syria to Persia, and even reached all the way to what is now modern-day Pakistan. The Ptolemies are colored in blue, and they famously ruled over Egypt. And colored in green are the Antagonids, which ruled over Macedonia and Greece. What's interesting to note is that the Seleucids and the Ptolemies fought quite a few, border wars over what is now was then Judea, which is now modern day Israel, Palestine, and I guess you could say Lebanon. So it is quite interesting to see just how the borders were constantly shifting. So it is quite fascinating to note. And for the purposes of this presentation, I will be briefly going over each of the kingdoms respectively, just in a brief manner, of course. So beginning in the reading from the text, the Antagonids would endure many tribulations, often of their own making, during their reign over Macedonia and Greece. Antigonus, for example, attempted to expand his kingdom's territory at the expense of his former comrades. In response, the latter group formed a temporary coalition to fight against Macedonia, which eventually resulted in Antigonus's death in 301 BC. His own son Demetrius would eventually succeed him. However, he was forced into exile from his kingdom in 288. It wasn't until 272 BC when Demetrius' own son finally secured the Macedonian throne for his family. This dynasty would last until the year 168 BC. And pictured here is actually Demetrius' own son. Reading from the text, a coin bearing the image of Antigonus Gonatas, who would reestablish his family's dynasty within Macedonia and Greece after his father's exile. What is interesting to note, I don't think I wrote it here, I didn't write it here, but it is interesting to note that he actually was, became king 2 times. He ruled temporarily, but then he was deposed, but then he came back in 272 BC. I just think that was an interesting tidbit to, include or mention within this presentation. Next, we have the Seleucids in the east. Reading from the text once more, out of the 3 major kingdoms that arose after Alexander's death, none of them faced such drastic territorial changes as the Seleucids did. Not only did they give their easternmost lands to Chandragupta's Mauryan Empire in exchange for war elephants, it was like 500 war elephants, by the way, they would eventually lose most of Persia to the Parthians during the 240s BC. If that wasn't enough, Professor Kevin Grimm even notes in his lecture that the Ptolemies and the Seleucids constantly fought over the eastern Mediterranean coast. Despite all these challenges, their kingdom would endure until the year 63 BC. I think, actually, I think it was 64 BC. I might have made a mistake there. But anyway, here we have a bust of Seleucus I of Nicator, who founded his empire in 305 BC. It is kind of interesting to note that even despite all their territorial changes, they were the second longest lasting Hellenic kingdom, which succeeded Alexander. And finally, we have most famously the Ptolemies in Egypt. The most famous of the kingdoms which arose after the Macedonian Empire collapse was none other than Ptolemaic Egypt. Not only did it survive the longest out of the three kingdoms discussed, it was also the most politically stable. This largely came about due to wise governing decisions made by the Ptolemies, coupled with daunting geographic barriers which helped defend it from land invasions. What's more is that Alexandria became the ancient equivalent to today's New York. People from various religious and ethnic backgrounds all huddled together in the financial, intellectual, and cultural capital of the ancient world. This dynasty would enjoy its control over the city until the time of Cleopatra in the 1st century BC. Now, I didn't mention it here, but Alexandria is also famous for its famous library, which was one of the first, I guess you could say, proper academic institutions in the world. Like, apparently I read in the book that had over 500,000 scrolls, and it was a very impressive collection. And over here we have the famous an artistic impression of what the famous lighthouse of Alexandria may have looked like. What is interesting to note is that part of it, in some form, actually survived until 1480 AD, which is only 12 years before Columbus's famous voyage to the Americas. It is kind of interesting to note just how, I guess you could say, relatively recent this is, because this is only like a little over 500 years from where we are in the present. Now, this section is titled The Art of War. Reading from the text, in order to protect the respective domains, the three Hellenistic kingdoms began to reorganize how their armies functioned. Although tactics largely remained the same, the pool of where soldiers were recruited had changed. As author Thomas R. Martin notes in his book, Hellenistic royal forces were composed of professional soldiers, and even the Greek city-states in the Hellenistic period increasingly hired mercenaries instead of calling up citizens as troops. While this had the positive effect of creating full-time professional armies, it also resulted in military expenditures rising considerably. And over here we have a fresco of a Macedonian soldier who had been. This is how they would have presumably looked like during this period. Although it is interesting to note that this full-time army was kind of a point of concern for some monarchs, because they constantly had to find ways of paying for their soldiers. This is why, historically speaking, if they couldn't find their soldiers, they would typically loot famous places of wealth. So yeah, this actually, if you're more recent history, 1527, during the sack of Rome, part of the reason, from what I remember, is that they wanted to get paid. So it was very important that they found a way to pay their soldiers. But however, war and politics wasn't the only thing going on. Reading from my text that I wrote, despite taking up most of the attention in the history books, war and political developments were not the only things that were happening. In fact, so many scientific and mathematical discoveries were made during this time that it is often referred to as the Golden Age of Science. Not only did Euclid teach his students about the geometric principles which now bear his name, in the 2nd century BC, Archimedes was able to calculate the approximate value of pi. Other geniuses include Aristarchus of Samos and Eratosthenes of Cyrene. The former correctly postulated a heliocentric model of the solar system long before it became widely accepted, and the latter is known for calculating the circumference of the Earth with stunning accuracy. These accomplishments are all the more impressive once we consider that these men did not have the advanced equipment we have today. It is kind of interesting, and also here's a portrait of Archimedes. who is actually the one who is credited to have been saying "Eureka" after he discovered how to measure like the weight of things with utilizing water, or like the volume of something utilizing water. And it is interesting to note that this painting isn't, I guess you could say, necessarily historically accurate, in that it kind of portrays Archimedes in what would be more familiar 17th century context. But it is nevertheless a beautiful painting by Baroque artist Domenico Fetti, who was an Italian painter from Rome. And this particular piece was from 1620. Also, it is interesting to note that Archimedes himself was from Syracuse, which is in modern day Sicily, which was in Sicily, which is now in modern day Italy. This next section is about like the philosophy. So, reading from my text, during this period, Greek philosophers shifted their focus from metaphysical topics, such as those explored by Plato, to more materialistic ones. The main goals of this development were to A. to explain how men should live, and B. to secure as much human independence from the fate of chance. Although there were many philosophical inquiries made by a variety of thinkers during this period, broadly speaking, the two most important schools of thought were Epicureanism and Stoicism. The former's founder, Epicurus, emphasized the importance of living a life of pleasure. Although this sounds rather self-indulgent to our modern ears, Epicurus didn't mean it in the way a modern person is probably conjuring it. Author Thomas Martin notes in his book, he, Epicurus, insisted that true pleasure of an absence of disturbance from pain and from the continuing everyday turbulence, passions, and desires of an ordinary human. Basically, I kind of maybe messed up here, but basically, like, Epicurus insisted that in order to live a life free from an absence of disturbance, a person should live in a society of friends and family apart from the cares of the common world. So this, according to Epicurus, this was the best way to live a life of of peace and free of worry. It is quite interesting. So it is kind of interesting to note how it's kind of, I guess you could say, more isolated and insulated from the rest of the world. Stoicism, by contrast, emphasized different virtues. Rather than pursuing a life of pleasure, Stoics believe, and still believe, that a person should pursue excellence. This meant that a person should live in harmony with what they call universal nature, which was the driving force behind what is commonly known as fate. In addition, they believed that reason, in conjunction with experience, resulted in a person achieving harmony with what is truly good. Another interesting to note about these school of thoughts, both Epicurean and Stoicism, is that they were also applied to women just as much as they were to men. I think this is actually a very, I guess you could say, interesting philosophical development, because I guess typically most people, I guess, during this time didn't really consider, oh yeah, this philosophy could apply just as much to women as it does to men. So it is interesting to note that both of these schools of thought recognized, that even women could, pursue like these philosophic lifestyles in the same way as a man could. And over here, we have a marble bust of famous Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who reigned between 161 to 180 AD. Although he didn't live during the Hellenistic period, his famous work Meditations is considered one of the best Stoic texts to be written. I just thought this was also interesting because it is interesting to see just how much of the impact Greek thought had on the Roman world in general. Of the faithful masses. Now, this section is mainly about the religious developments that occurred. Much like everything else, religious developments also occurred during this period. Although they were less drastic in certain places like Athens, which, by the way, tended to be more conservative and not really adopt foreign cults as much, other places such as Delos and Alexandria experienced many. Concerning the former, the island eventually became the home to many cults, Greek and non-Greek alike. Of course, there were temples to Zeus, Apollo, Hermes, Heracles, and the like. But in addition to these, there were also temples to Serapis, a Greco-Egyptian god synchronized in Alexandria, and also to Isis and Anubis. Within Alexandria itself, there were multiple religious temples of differing faiths located within it. Not only did Greeks and Egyptians have their own temples where they could worship at, Jews were also present within the city. What's fascinating is that all these groups lived in relative harmony with each other. This is actually a very interesting historical tidbit because we assume that, oh, religious tolerance is, I guess you could say, a more recent idea. Although I guess this is technically not necessarily the case because certain empires did allow people to keep their local religions for the sake of stability, since it was more practical not to oppose a foreign religion on a conquered people. This is why, I guess you could say Persia and Rome did the same thing. And also here, interestingly enough, is a Roman statue or Roman interpretation of the Egyptian goddess Isis, who was originally worshipped in Egypt. Despite her origins, her cult would spread throughout the Hellenistic world, worshipped by Greeks and Egyptians alike. What is also interesting is that for a time during the early first millennium, the cult of Isis actually competed with Christianity for followers. So it is interesting to note just how different the religious structure was like back then. Next thing I wanted to discuss about the arts. So, artistic pieces during this period were characterized by being quite dynamic and adaptive. This is perhaps most visible in the literature of this time. For example, since Athens was under the control of Macedonia for much of this period, writers could no longer write comedic pieces criticizing the ruling class. This limitation did not stop writers such as Menander and Philemon from creating timeless classics. Some notable non-Athenian authors during this time included Sicilian Theocrates, who was the first author to note the differences between the countryside and the city, and Callimachus from North Africa, who demanded a division between the intellectual elites and the uneducated masses. Basically he thought that his works were only good for like intellectual elites rather than the uneducated masses, which I guess you could say in some way was a bit, classist, but oh well. However, they weren't the only artists during the time. Sculptors began to produce more lively statues compared to their classical era counterparts. No longer were figures so stiff. Instead, their poses became more dynamic and emotional. Not only that, but non-Greeks were often depicted within these pieces as well. One of the most famous pieces includes the Dying Gaul. What's more is that statues of abstract ideas, such as peace, also became popular. Now, over here, we have a close-up of the Dying Gaul statue. Reading from my own text, the Dying Gaul statue is truly an exceptional piece. Not only is it a remarkable structure in and of itself, it's also notable in that it portrays a non-Greek in a heroic and noble way. This fact would have been very unusual during the classical period. So it is kind of interesting to note that there was, I guess, a shift in mentality, in that during this period, Greeks recognized that even non-Greeks could, possess virtues such as nobility and honor and whatnot. So it is kind of interesting to see that historical development occur, because this typically during the classical period they would have only portrayed Greeks and whatnot, and they would have really have portrayed non-Greeks in any, I guess you could say, positive light. But here it's quite the opposite, where they can portray that non-Greeks are incapable of virtue as well. The Hellenic world. The extent to which Greek culture had spread throughout the known world cannot be understated. Not only had Koine Greek become the lingua franca of the ancient world, much like how English is today, Greek artistic expression also maintained a lasting impact. In fact, Greek influence spread all the way from Greece in the west to India in the east. What's more is that even after the final Hellenic kingdom fell, Greek influence on the eastern Mediterranean would last up right until the fall of Constantinople in 1453 AD. Now, this is actually one thing I really wanted to mention here, is that Greek artistic expression was so widespread and that a relatively, I guess, niche historical art form known as Greco-Buddhist art flourished for many centuries. Pictured here is the depiction of the Buddha in a Hellenistic style statue. This particular statue is believed to have been created sometime within the 1st and 2nd century AD. What's more is that this particular statue was discovered in what is now Pakistan. And it is quite at least that's from what I read, it was in Pakistan. But it is quite interesting to note just how widespread Greek culture was, that we had these cultural fusions that aren't really talked about. Although the book does mention that there were Greek Buddhists in passing, But it is quite interesting to note just that Greek culture was so widespread, so I guess widely admired, that even like not that Greek Buddhists decided to make a statue, or like Buddhists decided to make a statue in the Greek tradition. And this is actually a really cool statue because it's not something you see every day. I just wanted to highlight this because it just shows the extent to which Greek culture had spread throughout the known world. The Iron Thrones are falling. This section will deal with how, like each of each of the Hellenistic kingdoms fell. It is generally agreed amongst historians that the Hellenistic period came to end with the death of Cleopatra. Her death was significant because she was the final Ptolemaic ruler of Egypt before it was conquered by the Romans. The fall of Ptolemaic Egypt, however, was only the final chapter of a historical development that had been going on for more than a century. Rome conquered the Antigonids in Macedonia in 168 BC. They would then conquer the Seleucids in Syria in 64 BC. Despite these conquests, Greek culture would endure throughout the Mediterranean long after the final Hellenic kingdom had been conquered. In fact, aspects of it would even be adopted by Rome herself. And over here, we have a Roman relief depicting the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. This battle was significant in that it marked the beginning of the end for Mark Antony, who was the lover of Cleopatra. Both of them would commit suicide the following year, leaving Octavian, Augustus Caesar, with no more rivals. So it is kind of interesting to note that our story kind of began with the death of one king and ends kind of with the birth of another emperor. So it is kind of interesting to note that there was a bit of a, I guess you could say, historical connection between Alexander the Great and Augustus Caesar. It is kind of interesting to note, although obviously this connection was not necessarily a positive one because Augustus was an enemy of Cleopatra, and he considered her, I guess, a rival that needed to be conquered. But it is nevertheless interesting to see that, I guess you could say that Alexander, he kind of, because he died so young, we never got to see what he might have been like in his prime, or like how he might have governed more. Whereas Augustus, you get to see how brilliant he was, not in terms of military, but also in terms of like governance. So, but however, that's an interesting topic for another time. Anyway, I just wanted to say thank you for listening to this presentation,